Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. As the war drums are beating and we're told over and over again, don't worry, this one's going to be done by Christmas. We're not going to put boots on the ground. I can feel that old feeling in my, the middle of my chest, that worried feeling building up, knowing that ultimately we have been down this path before. And so I thought today would be a good idea to go into why nation building ultimately doesn't work. A lot of people are telling me that we have no intention of nation building, but I feel like that might not be the case. And I thought it was worth our time to review the failures and why we have had failures in this endeavor before. And joining me today to do that is a first-time guest on the show. You've enjoyed his work on Peaky Blinders and in Oppenheimer. Cillian Murphy, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Auron. You're mentioning, right, the Cillian Murphy meme. It's funny, that started, right, the first time I sort of showed up at a conference. And I think a lot of people were confused because, up until very recently, I didn't show my face. And so now everyone's in on the joke, right? But again, thank you so much for having me on.
No, it's funny. First time I met you at the conference, like someone described, described you that way afterwards. And I was like, be careful, you're gonna dox Burden. That's too accurate. Like that's actually that's too good of a descriptor. So
between that and having possibly the worst anonymous profile picture, it is not a picture of me, but it looks really close to one. Let's be honest. If I didn't do it, someone was gonna connect the two dots there. And it was going to happen eventually, right?
Fair enough. All right. Well, again, Jay Burden is here with us. We're going to get into regime change and why it has repeatedly failed. But before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. Wake up, America, and fuel your morning with a cup of coffee that salutes the stars and stripes. We're talking about Crockett Coffee. Their blends start with premium beans, artisan roasted in small batches in America's heartland, unlocking a rich, smooth flavor that turns your first sip into pure rally the day energy. But here's the real kicker. 10% of every dollar goes straight to Tunnel to Towers, supporting our nation's heroes and their families. So when you brew Crockett, you're not just waking up, you're standing up for the people that have put it all on the line for our freedoms. I've tried a couple of their roast options, and now I'm drinking a cup every morning. So are you ready to join the coffee revolution? Head over to crockettcoffee.com. That's crockettcoffee.com. And make sure to use the promo code THEBLAZE for 15% off your order. That's promo code The Blaze for 15% off. So, Mr. Burden, I've been told, from the beginning of this whole episode with what's going on with Israel and Iran, I was told from the beginning, Israel can do it itself. We're not going to get involved. Don't worry. We're basically just there to say, hey, let Israel do its thing. That's more or less our role. And then I started noticing that the very same people who told me not to worry and that, we're not going to get involved. The line started to become, well, of course, we're going to do a few strikes. Like, obviously, that's going to be the case, the opportunity. But, Trump has said he's not for regime change. So we're not, don't worry. It's just going to be a few strikes. And I can already feel the mission creep before we've even involved ourselves in the mission. We're already watching each step as we go. We're being assured that we're not going to go that area. Don't be ridiculous. Of course we wouldn't try to put this whole thing, through the same process that we did in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that seems like an obvious thing that we should recognize. But ultimately I'm looking at this and I'm not going to pretend to be a geopolitical expert, right? Like this is not my wheelhouse. There are people much more knowledgeable on this than me. I have listened to them. I try to understand their positions. But if you want to know about political theory, I'm your guy. I'm not Mearsheimer. Like I'm not one of these guys, right? But ultimately, many people have pointed out, and I feel like this is pretty accurate, observing what's going on, that if we strike, if we get involved with Israel in this, ultimately the goal has to be putting boots on the ground, because we've already been told this is not just, at first it was just a strike to get rid of nukes, right? Like, oh, we're taking out nuclear capacity. And then we hear, actually, no, this is a regime change strike. Like explicitly, we are now involved. The goal is regime change. So this is a decapitation strike. We're taking out the rulers and everything else. Well, I think as we've seen from many other Middle Eastern nations, when you destabilize and take out the regime, you can't just like let it sit there. These things immediately turn into cesspools where radicals gather. There's different factions break out. Terrible things happen. And the people inside are of course get this horrible war, but also they become radicalized against Israel and the United States because they feel like these are the people who put them in this situation. Bad governance is bad, but no governance is actually often worse. And so it seems like inevitably someone's going to have to rebuild Iran if we strike it. And I don't think Israel's going to do it because they don't have the logistical power. They don't have the geopolitical heft. And ultimately, I just don't think they have the political will to involve themselves in going in and completely controlling yet another Middle Eastern Muslim area. And so ultimately, it feels like that job's going to fall to the Western world, which means the United States. Am I crazy in feeling the kind of gradient we're moving on? Is that all in my brain, or is there any validity there?
So obviously you're not crazy. You and I think, are in the same boat. Primarily our interests are political theory, not geopolitics. But you and I share something in common, which is that we can look all the way back into the past of roughly 10 to 15 years ago and look at what America has done, and we can see how it worked out, right? We're in the post-Afghanistan world, right? And we can certainly quibble about how we left that war, how it was handled. But very clearly, that did not work. That was an absolute quagmire. We lost billions in treasure and entirely too many American lives, and accomplished absolutely nothing, right? Sure, we got some of them, right? Certainly bad people. But at the end of the day, Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. Obviously, we got Saddam Hussein. Is his country a better place? Is the area safer? And you mentioned earlier, right, the kind of early saber rattling about nukes. Well, as I'm sure you remember, Saddam had them too, right? He had yellow cake. And it turned out that that was a lie. This is the exact same playbook being run over again. And so when we look at regime change, there are kind of several layers to look at it, right? The first, which is the mission creep. That's a very real complaint, right? The idea is, oh, this will be a quick, easy thing. We'll be done by Christmas. We've seen that over and over again. That's not how it works. But a secondary critique is to say, like, okay, let's say you get exactly what you want. What problems does that solve for us? And the answer is effectively none. Iran's not a good country. I don't want to live in Iran. I don't have Iranian interest at heart. But we've seen this playbook over and over again. And much like Charlie Brown in the football, you can't really blame us for staring down the football the fourth time and thinking maybe Lucy might pull the football out and we'll end up flat on our back. This is far from some kind of crazy prognosis. We've seen this over and over and over again with the exact same results. And it's especially disconcerting and sort of disappointing from someone like President Trump, who ran on an anti-war agenda. Don't forget that the MAGA movement is sort of the sequel to the Tea Party, right? A sequel to another sort of insurgent right-wing movement in America that was very, very conservative, and albeit that had a lot to do initially with fiscal concerns, but the foreign policy was right there as well. And to me, there's a very real question, which is, if the MAGA movement becomes a vehicle for John McCain or George Bush-esque foreign policy, what was the point of it to begin with? It's become the exact same party it always was. And again, there are certain things I like about Trump. I think he's very funny. I think his opinions on immigration are completely and totally correct. But at the same time, if the man who went to go drain the swamp has been absorbed into it, what was the point of this whole endeavor?
This is relatively breaking news, but there's an interview that has just come out with Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson. And I might end up reviewing that Friday, cutting some clips and going over what happened. But one of the things that Ted Cruz said in that interview that Tucker Carlson challenges is that Iran has made multiple attempts on Donald Trump's life. And he's echoing the sentiment that Bibi Netanyahu put out to try to say that the United States should involve itself in this war. And I've got to say, that's a very concerning accusation. Netanyahu made it about the two guys, the one assassin from the rooftop and the other the golf course. That obviously can't be true. And I think Ted Cruz kind of walked that back on his behalf. But he said there are real attempts to assassinate Trump. And obviously, that is far more important to me personally as a cause for war than kind of what has been thrown out there right now. Like, if there is real and incontrovertible evidence that Iran is literally deploying hitmen into the United States to kill the president of the United States, that is a real cause for war. That is the most just war one can fight. If you have another country literally sending assassins to kill your leader, that is a declaration of war. I think everyone could recognize that. And yet this was supposed to theoretically have been happening for years. And we did not go to war with Iran over it. But now, all of a sudden, we're involved in what could be possibly this full-blown attempt at regime change. They're now acknowledging it's not just about getting rid of the nuclear capacity, it is the regime change. And I guess the thing that concerns me is if we already had a total and real justification to go to war with Iran, why didn't we use it then? Why are we waiting now at this moment after Israel has already begun a unilateral strike while we were in negotiations with this country? First, why were we negotiating with a country that's literally trying to murder or actively trying to kill our president? And second, why did we wait until this moment to strike? It's just one of those things that it just blows my mind. Like one of these things can't be true. I don't know. Again, am I crazy here, or does that make sense? I don't know.
That's a very reasonable objection, right? Clearly, there is a vested interest in war with Iran. We've seen this for decades. One of the things that's been making the rounds on social media is definitive proof in newspapers, media from the last 30 years saying Iran has a nuke over and over again in the 90s, in the 2000s, the 2010s, and now today. So obviously, if there was incontrovertible proof, why didn't we declare war then? Similarly, right, if there is this incontrovertible proof of Iranian hitmen, Persian assassins kind of popping out of barrels and slashing him with sabers, like why haven't we seen it? Because again, like you said, if that's true, like awesome, let's dig into it, show it to me.
Yeah,
because this is a radically different discussion if instead of some kind of pasty-faced incel assassin in Butler, PA, it's an Iranian some sort of commando. Then again, fair enough, right? I wouldn't necessarily be in favor of some sort of rerun of Iraq or Afghanistan, but there's at least an argument to be made. And again, it seems as if this is motivated reasoning. We want to have a war with Iran. There's a vested interest. There's a lobby that wants to fight Iran. And it seems as if any old excuse will do, right? Any reason, to quote John McCain, to bomb Iran is a good enough one for them. And to me, right, it's an important question to ask, what is the goal of this, right? Because over and over again, we've seen these wars go wrong. And the question is, well, did they go wrong, right? Well, of course they went wrong from the stated purpose, which is to turn these countries into kind of, verdant democratic paradises, right? You can imagine sort of a Switzerland set in the, the Hindu Kush, right? That didn't happen. Or is the goal to create a forever war, right? To create another place where unlimited money can be dumped into an impossible cause. And as Moldbug referred it, create a self-licking ice cream cone, right? A system that can dispense patronage to thousands and thousands of people, where almost unlimited money can be laundered through it. And there's no real accountability. And conservatives were very right to point this out in Ukraine. They were right to say, this is a war that does not serve our interests. This is a massive money laundering operation. And sadly, many of those same people are chomping at the bit to create the exact same circumstance in Iran. And I think it's right to look at that and say, well, did those wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, did they fail at their purpose? And the response to that is, well, which purpose? Because thankfully, Trump has so far shown a desire to keep America out of these useless foreign forever wars. Right? We all remember when his general staff lied to him about U.S. troops in Syria, which, okay, he didn't get what he wanted, but that seems to be a good faith effort on his part. He's over and over again said the war in Ukraine needs to end. And so it's very disappointing to see apparently an about face on the war, which I guess isn't official yet, but let's be honest, the war in Iran. And one of the other things that's been interesting to me has been the response from both, should we say, legacy conservative media and also from the members of the Republican Party. Because I'll put it this way: when you have when you have Ted Cruz sort of beclowning himself, right, unable to make a cogent defense, it goes back to my earlier point about it seems as if this is motivated reasoning. There is no real argument. It is just something they want. And look, like Cruz has made strides in some areas. He's failed in others. But to me, if that's the best argument you've got, if the champion Harvard debater, right, the guy who wrote the Harvard Law Review, can't come up with an argument that passes muster, well, why is this something that we as a nation should support?
Yeah, the fact that in that interview he went straight to, well, the Bible says we have to be loyal to the secular modern state of Israel. Just, like, I know that's a belief that some people hold, but the fact that he openly stated that as his real driving decision making factor was rather concerning. Again, as the Harvard debate guy, but you did jump to the cut to the quick of kind of where I was going with this is why these things don't work, or why we participate in things that we know are unlikely to work in the way that we want them to. And you're right to go directly to the money. The fact that defense contractors and weapons manufacturers and all these other services that are going to be tied up in here, the money starts flowing. It's completely unaccountable. It's all going to this super important cause, so you can't question any of it. It's all kind of behind the veil due to its military and intelligence nature, and so you just don't know what's going through and who it's going to. And of course, I've had friends who specifically their job is to go, into villages in the middle of Afghanistan and just hand bags of money to warlords to keep them from blowing up troops along the side of the road. Like this money goes everywhere and it goes to the worst possible people, and everybody's getting paid, and so nobody has an incentive to say no. But I do want to, well, that's the most practical and correct answer to give about this. I do want to go back to kind of why regime change as a general idea, a nation building as a general idea, is difficult. Because obviously regime change happens all the time, right? We know regimes rise, regimes fall, sometimes from outward pressure, inward pressure, or internal pressure, these kind of things. There's all kind of reasons why we see different regimes rise and fall. However, there's a different thing between going to war with an enemy regime, ultimately trying to stop it, and then the actual occupation and rebuilding of the nation. And this is something that I think is very difficult because the US is an empire. I think people watching this show have kind of at least come to that realization that ultimately, even though we don't use the term, the American empire is real. However, the American empire operates as a very strange empire because classically you would go in, conquer, replace a ruler, you would have regime change, right? But that ruler would be it would become a satrapy, right? It would become a king who it's still a ruler of the people, and they would rule in your stead, and they would basically often operate their country the way that they wanted and kind of kick things back up to you, right? Like this is kind of the classic imperial model. This is what many nations, Rome and others, did ultimately to control these things. But the United States does not like that idea. We don't like the idea that we're going to like occupy and have an explicit extortionary relationship, or I should say a relationship of extraction of value from a client state. It happens, but we don't like that one-to-one. We don't like it formalized. And so we create this weird informal thing where we go in and tell the nation, we're liberating for freedom. We're gonna democracy, and we look not just to go in and knock down the bad guys, but we look to go in and completely rebuild the system of government. And because once we have rebuilt the system of government, we've replaced it basically with our own institutions. We've taken out the natural institutions of that civilization and replaced it with our own, thinking that this will like ultimately give us control of that system. And this is really where it breaks down, because it's almost become a joke at this point. But of course, it was a very real doctrine of American foreign policy, and specifically conservative understanding of foreign policy, to believe that like if you just went into a nation and you gave them the Constitution and democracy, well, all the Thomas Jeffersons and George Washingtons and Benjamin Franklins that have been hiding in the caves of Afghanistan were going to flow out and suddenly create this modern paradise. People do the same thing with Iran now, right? They start throwing up pictures of Iranian women in bikinis, and this is the goal. We can go back to this, not understanding that there are like real critical cultural differences that don't just melt away because you apply a constitution to someone. And that's why, even though you can overlay, you can put an overcode on the civilization for many years at the point of a gun, but the minute you walk away, Afghanistan becomes Afghanistan again, right? And that's the problem that we see over and over.
Well, there's actually an interesting point here. Iran was not always an Islamic republic. So you could almost say that the mullahs are doing exactly what we tried to do in Afghanistan, take over a culture at the point of a gun. So not necessarily the most interesting point, but something to mention. But you're entirely right. That governance, right, the way that humans organize themselves is a natural thing, right? It is not to say spontaneous, but it is an outgrowth of culture. They're self-reinforcing. And so you can look at, for instance, my people, right, the Scotch-Irish, and see that although governance forms have kind of changed through time, there's certain constants, right? They tend to be fiercely independent. They don't really like being told what to do. And that manifests both in the borderers in, kind of the north of England, and also in someone like Andrew Jackson, right? Or the hollers of Appalachia. There's a through line through all of those. And while the context for that changes, you couldn't necessarily put a bunch of Scotch-Irish into China and expect them to do well, right? It is a culture for which they are not necessarily adapted to succeed. And similarly, right, when we look at the previous examples of regime change, a great example is Saddam Hussein's country, right? That seems to be a culture of gangsterism, right? You have a strong man at the top who's, let's be honest, not a particularly nice guy, who has his excesses, but he keeps order. And when we try to send in Marines to, oversee an election, it's like, well, does it turn into America? Clearly not. Well, perhaps one of the best examples of this is the African nation of Liberia, right? James Madison sent over some freed slaves, gave them a copy of the American Constitution, and basically said, all right, have at it. And Liberia now is perhaps most famous for the Invisible Children campaign, which was to end horrific child soldiers, and the exploits of a man rather crudely known as General Buck Naked, right? A man who was infamous for the most horrible crimes against humanity you can imagine in an absolutely horrible civil war. That country has been ravaged by internal conflict, ravaged by every depravity you can name. And again, the point is not necessarily to kind of throw shade at or to impugn the honor of your very patriotic Liberian listeners, but to say very clearly the secret missing ingredient was not a copy of the US Constitution. There was something other there that made it work, at least for a time, in America, and did not allow it to work in Liberia. And again, this is another problem with whether you want to call it the post-war consensus or the rules-based international order, which is this idea that there is one legitimate form of government, and any state which does not consent to that is de facto illegitimate and must be overthrown. And look, I'll be honest, I would much rather live in a Western democracy than some sort of despotic dictatorship, right? Given the choice, if I had to live in one rather than the other. But the problem is you can't simply change the structure and the culture of a nation like flicking a switch. And I say this with a lot of historical data on my side. We've tried this over and over and over again, and by and large created nothing but human misery, right? How many Afghanis died? How many Iraqis died? You can ask Madison Albright if she weren't in a somewhat warmer spot now. But point is, right, we've run this playbook again and again and again. And it seems to have immiserated everyone involved, certainly America, right? The actual people of America. It's very useful for certain international interests. It's very useful for certain zip codes in Northern Virginia. But if we can say that the MAGA movement is in any way a populist movement, if the deal Trump makes is rewards for the American people and punishments for their enemies, then this is the worst, the most America last thing Trump could possibly do. And I say this as someone who has been, generally speaking, quite positive on the man. I'm not some kind of impassioned Trump hater, but fundamentally, you have to call a spade a spade. And this is a very bad move from that perspective.
Yeah, and again, to be clear, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump says a lot of things, right? And so it's one of those scenarios where Trump will say something publicly, he'll wait to see what the response is, then he'll react, right? We've seen this multiple times. We've seen it with the H-1B stuff. We just saw it when it came to the carve-outs for specific industries for deportations. Trump floats something, he sees the explosion and then he kind of backs it up, or, maybe he doesn't publicly correct it, but the administration comes around and kind of changes something. People can feel how they want about that communication style, but that means that Trump is somebody who is very open to the public's perception of what he's doing. And so, when you're pushing back against this, the best thing is to do is just to remind Trump of the commitments he's already made, the legacy he's already talked about. In his farewell address from his first term, he said, the proudest thing he had was that he had started no new wars, right? Like that was a key thing he himself identified in that. And so that's really critical. And I think that that's far more useful than going in and being, I've had Dave Smith on the show multiple times. I like Dave, but him going out and being like, we immediately have to impeach Donald Trump. Like that does not help the scenario, right? That, if anything, that just digs Donald Trump deeper into the bunker of people you don't want him to be listening to. And so I think that that's a tactical mistake. But the other thing I want to point out that you said, which was really critical, and people will point to this, so I'm glad you brought it up because it is important. That the mullahs in Iran themselves are an artificial imposition on kind of Iranian culture, right? Like this Persian culture is ancient. This is not some random collection of hill people. This is a proud, long, powerful group of people who have dominated that region many times over. Many a Roman consular broke on the shores of Iranians in one way or another. And so I think it's important to recognize that one of the reasons Iran is so unstable now is it already had regime change, right? It already had a artificial imposition of something. The Shah does not represent the real Iran, but neither do the mullahs, right? Both of these regimes have been imposed from the outside and therefore chafe, right? And this is a huge issue that we have to understand. When you don't allow people to live in a certain way, when you don't allow them to live in the way that they are used to living, there is always going to start building up that resentment. The rule will always feel artificial. And this is the thing that continually guarantees some kind of backlash against you. And so this is one of the key problems with regime changes, like down in the bones of these people, attempting to change customs and ways can be very difficult. I will always remember a story from my buddy. He's in Afghanistan again. His job is to go around and bribe warlords, to not blow up U.S. troops. And he's handing enough money to these guys to completely transform their village, right? Like indoor plumbing, like all kinds of stuff you could do, set up clinics. You could revolutionize the quality of life for the people living in those villages. And without fail, the first thing every single warlord did was take the money and build a road to his dad's house. And he was very confused. Like, why are you doing this? Why are the people okay with this? And he found that actually in every single village, not only were the people okay with this, they expected that of that leader. And if he had not done it, he probably would have lost stature and lost his ability to run the thing, might have been killed for showing that level of weakness and not prioritizing that. And it's at moments like that when you realize, like, oh no, the results of cultures are very much tied to the actual beliefs of the people and the practices of the people in that culture. It's not just this weird thing that, every people are actually just, Western democracies yearning to be free and looking to modernize. Deep down in their core, they hold beliefs that they all agree with implicitly that push them a general direction and either prevent or accelerate their ability to modernize and all of these things. It's not something you can just walk in and hand to people and expect them to fall into that behavior.
Well, and the funny thing is, the Persians themselves, long time ago, actually got this. They understood this, right? If you read the Old Testament, you'll notice that Cyrus is referred to in a very positive light. He was loved, and well, why was that? Well, it's because he sent the Israelites, back home from Babylon and gave them money to rebuild the temple, right? It was seen as a magnanimous gesture. Now, look, Cyrus still called the shots, right? That was still his territory, but he granted them the leeway to govern themselves, right? He wasn't saying, you remaining tribes need to organize yourself as Persians. You need to, worship Zoroaster, though that was later. But point is, right, the idea of the Persian gods, right, that was seen, and the ancients understood this as something people wouldn't stand for, right? Go back to Caesar. Why were the Gauls always rebelling? Well, they were rebelling for freedom, right? But in the way we understand it, right? Were they rebelling so that they could, send their little girls to school and, have OnlyFans? Like, of course not. They wanted self-rule. They wanted to be ruled by someone who was like them and be ruled by their own laws. Again, this is something in our own tradition we understood about the American Indians, right? Andrew Jackson, who I've now referenced twice, who is sort of burned in effigy, he understood that in order for the Indian tribes to maintain their culture, they needed to have a space where they could have their own laws and customs, right? If they were to become Americanized, they would integrate, they would disappear, which is largely what we've seen. But he, in very good faith, created the reservation system as a way to preserve that way of life. The idea would be, one, it would be pacification, right? There's no longer conflict for two people, two laws in the same territory. But also, right, if that thing, that culture is going to stay what it is, it must be allowed to express itself. And the idea that we can, have a regime change and do anything else other than create this kind of eternal sand trap that we are stuck in as a nation for decades, inflame even more anti-American sentiment across the world, or sort of do what we did to South Korea, right? Where it technically worked, but we created this horribly broken society that, as of current day, cannot reproduce itself, right? The one time it kind of, and I really want to put a big asterisk on kind of, worked, right? We created a broken society, right? Something that has no vital force anymore, is not really identifiable as what it once was. And, again, I understand why the Korean War was fought. I think it's more justifiable than the forever wars we've mentioned. But nonetheless, right, even the so-called best case of creating an Americanized country, we play it out a couple generations, and where does it go, right? We have a dead, dying culture, right? Something that is not its own anymore. And so to me, even the so-called humanitarian arguments, which, let's be honest, are very, very thin. And we've already mentioned Madison Albright, among others, right? But, okay, sure, for a short time, those people may live, bountiful, Western existence of excess. But that culture dies. It goes away. And that's a sad, regrettable thing. And so to me, one of the most important things, in addition to, as you mentioned earlier, making your objections known, because we have seen Trump 180 on things, but also is to deny these people the moral ground. They are not humanitarians. They are not on the right side of history. They're using a horribly broken argument that even within living memory, we have seen cause countless deaths, billions in treasure wasted, and largely made the American people worse off than they would have been if they had never heard or had any reason to care about countries like Afghanistan.
So there's a lot that I want to touch there, because you hit some points that I was really going to bore into. So the first thing, historical examples. Yeah, you point out, the Caesar and the Gauls. Let's also not forget, the Romans and the Jews, because originally, of course, the Romans go in, they're governing with as light a hand as they can, because the Jews have this weird faith. Normally, the Romans can just go in and say, you got to worship the imperial cult, just throw Caesar into a temple somewhere, he's one of your gods, and then we move on, right? Not a big deal. The Jews have this weird thing, to the Romans, where like, no, we only worship one God, and that's really important to us. So at first they try to accommodate that. They're like, okay, well, the Jews get this like special thing where they don't have to, worship Caesar, because they're so big on this. They try to give them that cultural space, right? But the more control they want to exert on the Jews, the more they are pressured to, be good Roman citizens and fall in line and do this stuff. And eventually, you get to the point where the Jews are, doing terrorist attacks and things to try to free themselves from the continued imposition of Roman culture onto what they feel is their true way of being. And eventually the Romans get so angry that they just destroy the temple, right? Because they can't get these Jews to like worship and just do the minimum things to make them viable in the empire. That's how often nation building fails. Even guys who were famously great about like the Romans still had different cultures that they simply could not absorb. And so I think you're muted there.
Professional podcaster, ladies and gentlemen. Just a brief interjection, right? When we talk about the Romans, let's be honest, the Romans had a much stronger stomach for violence than we do.
Right.
Americans are quite comfortable, obviously, with kind of tiny pixelated images of, bombs dropping into cities. But the Romans crucified a lot of people, right? That was their version of pacification. I mean, even the phrase, right, salting the earth was what the Romans would do. They were quite adept at total war. And as has often been, raised, how committed are we to this? Because if we did invade a country of 90 million people by land, which is, I'm struggling for kind words to describe how stupid that would be, right? That would be disastrous. That would require a full-scale mobilization, right? The likes of which we saw in World War II or Korea and Vietnam. To accomplish what? Largely nothing. So again, and I'll throw it back to you, but when we pull this apart from multiple directions, right? Can it accomplish its stated goals? No. Are its stated goals good for us? Also no. Are we willing to pay the price of accomplishing those stated goals, even if possible? No. Sorry, I'll throw it back to you, Auron.
No, all very valid points. The only other part of that I was going to say is you hit on the example of South Korea. And one of the things, as I was making these points on Twitter, that the responses that I got back from guys like Wilford Riley and others is, well, of course, nation building works. We've nation built before, and they gave some of the examples you pointed to, South Korea and Japan and Germany. Well, again, we can look at South Korea. Okay, like you said, yes, technically we protected them from communism. Ultimately, I think they appreciate that. But on the current demographic route, North Korea is going to survive longer than South Korea. Like democracy artificially imposed on these people has actually been more destructive than the communist dictatorship of Kim Jong-un. Again, I would want to live in South Korea over North Korea, obviously, right? But the assumption that we just go in and we build this nation and then it works and it's fine, that is just obviously true. Like the spiritual death of that country has occurred. I mean, hopefully they turn it around, but as it's going, that's the situation. And the other two examples that they give over and over again, Germany and Japan, it's like, okay, so first we're saying, yes, we are nation building, right? Because we recognize that we think it's good and it works. B, we're admitting that we would basically need a world war, as you just pointed out, like a world war scale mobilization, because the only two examples you can give me that really worked, Japan and Germany, required a world war mobilization in order to do that. And then we occupied those nations for decades, right? Like, like we had our own dictators in those nations telling them, sometimes directly, like MacArthur, running Japan, like this, this is not theoretical. Like yes, you can change the regime if you plan to put your entire military, fight a world war, put your military in the middle of the country and basically deny them self-rule for generations. Yes, eventually you can start breaking some of their culture apart. But again, look at Japan and Germany spiritually. How are they doing? Right? Like,
and also, right, let's acknowledge it is entirely possible for the great grandsons of the men who conquered these nations to still be there, right? We still have soldiers there. And look, like, I get it, right? A military assignment to Okinawa isn't exactly, the worst thing. But at the same time, right, when we're talking about the commitment required, are you willing to commit generations, multiple generations of our men just being there, right, to occupy it? And again, you mentioned earlier that America is an empire, but we're very uncomfortable with saying it. And again, right, a world in which we have soldiers, and I can't remember exactly how many off the top of my head, but dozens and dozens of nations at any given time, that is an empire, right? We are doing the exact same thing under a kind of a thin moral fig leaf. And as much as I hate to say it, I'd be more sympathetic to the argument if it was, well, we don't care. Iran is another country, and if we conquer them, we're going to get XYZ Iranian export that will make the average American better. But that's not the deal we've got. We will be required to fight for that war, not you and I per se, but us as Americans, and receive absolutely nothing in benefit. It is quite possibly, again, and I'll say this over and over again, a classic example of this kind of America last foreign policy we've been fighting against for 70 years.
Well, and again, the culture is just so alien that commitment, as you're pointing out, would be generational. It would be, many generations of our men would be required to go there and do this. And the culture is so alien that we just don't have a hope of ultimately governing it in a way that is going, even if we break their spirit, which is its own goal, I guess. We don't have a way of governing it, connecting with that culture that will allow us to continue to be a part of it. I'm to be clear, I'm not advocating for this, but if we were going to invade and change any regime, why not go to the UK? Like, that's a country we actually have ties to. We actually have cultural ties to. Many of us are from. Our ancestors are from. We speak the language. These guys have nukes. They're oppressing their own people. They're persecuting Christians. They're literally demographically replacing their own population with Muslims and forcing the parents of raped daughters to do nothing. Like if you're worried about the Islamic threat in the West, why don't we just go and stop it in England? If you're going to go anywhere, again, not advocating for this, but if we're going to make the move, that makes a lot more sense to me.
Well, and Auron, to your point, right? If the barometer for why we should invade a country is they did something untoward on American soil, right? They either plotted to assassinate our president or were somehow vaguely connected to, two planes, tragically striking the Twin Towers, right? Well, if you remember all the way back 6 months ago, the UK Labour Party sent activists into America to campaign for Kamala Harris. They directly intervened in our election. And if that was enough to consider Russia our mortal foe when they did it, well, surely if we are principled liberals, if we are the kind of people who care about the rule of law, as I've been reliably informed that we should, well, then time to storm the beaches, right? Time to liberate London. Time to, drop in the 101st Airborne and get to work. Because clearly that's what we do. And I'm joking, right? It sounds ridiculous because clearly, as we've said over and over again, this is not a reason to point. This is not some, grand conclusion to an epic argument. This is something they want to do. And any excuse will do. Any opportunity, any set of facts they can twist towards this goal of creating another forever war it will be used. And I just want to reiterate, when we talk about the uniparty, the swamp, the cathedral, whatever, right? That sort of consensus around the set of issues that Washington will always coalesce around. Largely that is foreign policy, and largely that is starting these boneheaded foreign adventures. Because, as we've said, it doesn't serve our interests, Auron, but it is very good for those people. And that's ultimately what they care about.
Well, and finally, before we go to the questions of the people, I just want to point out that, obviously, a nuclear Iran is bad, right? This is not. Nobody thinks that them having a bomb or being in possession of this kind of technology and the ability to deploy it is ultimately good for the world. That said, at some point we have to deal with the fact that whether we like it or not, the United States introduced a weapon into the world that either creates global hegemony or global or a world where everyone has nukes and they all have a standoff. I'm going to nerd out here, but in Dune, in the Dune universe, every house has its own nukes, right? It has its own cache of weapons that it can deploy at a moment's notice. No one uses them because they're so dangerous, and it would have everyone turn against you. But every house has them, and this is what allows basically the feudal nature. It allows everything doesn't have to be centralized. Yes, there's an emperor, but these different great houses get to rule their areas because they have the firepower ultimately to devastate each other if they really wanted to, if things really came down to brass tacks. And that's a terrible way for the world to balance its power, but it is now the dynamic, right? Like we may be in a proxy war with Russia, which is insane that we're trying to start another war by being still engaged in a proxy war that was supposed to be over in 6 months last time. But we're not going directly to war with Russia because they have nukes, right? We're not going directly into North Korea and clearing out that regime because they have nukes. Everybody knows this. Everyone knows we're not going to Pakistan because they have nukes. Like, and the world leaders are not oblivious to this fact. So whether like they're insane despots who hate our guts and like want to use nukes to put a dirty bomb in the middle of Los Angeles, or they're just rational actors looking at the geopolitical situation and realizing there are only two options. I can be a country with nukes and have sovereignty, or I can be a country without nukes and have no sovereignty. They're going to pursue them, right? The rational step by every actor in the world is to pursue nukes. That doesn't mean I want them to have them, but I recognize that reality, right? Once someone builds tanks, you've got to build tanks. And the fact that another country is building tanks can't just be a cost of spell, like forever. Because at some point, like we're going to recognize that the geopolitical situation is one in which every country has this incentive. And so either they live under the umbrella of another country that has that capability, or they have it themselves. And if they live under the umbrella, they can be dictated to at will and be invaded, by other countries basically with that technology at will. And so I guess my whole point there is saying, unless you intend to invade every single country in the world and perpetually control all of their scientific and military development forever, the world will become one in which pretty much every country has this capability. It has to, otherwise sovereignty simply does not exist. At this point, possession of nuclear weapons is sovereignty. They are one and the same. And so I don't like any of that, but as someone who's just analyzing the situation rationally, I don't see how we ever escape that reality again, unless our stated goal is literally to occupy every nation and ensure that they do not develop weapons like this.
Well, and again, this is why, when we consider ourselves realists, right, we are taking up the role of Aristotle, right, in that famous School of Athens painting where he's pointing at the ground, right, what is. Look, I would love to live in a world where nukes just never existed. I mean, I would love to live in a world where any number of things didn't exist. Pick your favorite. But fundamentally, that's not where we live. And so similarly, right, when you're attacking these positions, we saw it with Afghanistan, people will say, well, don't you want XYZ good thing to happen? Don't you want little girls in Afghanistan to go to school? And look, those are good things. I would love for Afghanistan to be a lovely, beautiful country where everyone is safe. But fundamentally, we live in a world of hard constraints. And not only is that ultimately, as we've really beaten to death here, an impossibility, but as you've said, the only way to actually do that, right, much in the only way to get to a zero crime society, is to create this obvious nightmarish dystopia where everyone is controlled at all times. And in much the same way we would rightly look at Orwell's 1984 or any of the other kind of dystopian fiction of the 20th century and say, that's bad, I don't want to do it. Similarly, the idea of having a global empire where everyone, every state, every people is jammed into the same system and controlled at all times is obviously monstrous. We don't want that. No one else wants it. And so even though it's impossible, it's a very bad goal to strive for.
Agreed. All right, guys. Well, we're going to head over to the questions of the people. But before we do, Mr. Burden, where should people be looking for your excellent work?
Yeah, so my primary output is the Jay Burden Show. As you can see, I am using my real face. And that's because the Jay Burden Show is what I do now. It's my primary output. It's what I spend all my time doing. And so, of course, what that means is that there is both a paid and a free version of my show. Exact same content. You can find people like Auron, other people who've been on this show, and those episodes come out 3 days a week for free with ads. If the ads are a little bit annoying, or if you want to help me out, then you can find the Jay Burden Show, the premium version, on Substack, on Subscribestar, Patreon, and soon to be Gumroad. But again, Auron, thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. And everybody should go over and help Mr. Burden launch his independent career over there. Very important that our guys are able to get these things off the ground. So please go subscribe and give him support if you can. All right, guys, let's head over to the people here. We got Melon, who says, every time one of our guys' face reveals, it's a Giga Chad, many such cases. Lots of winning.
Thank you very much, Melon. My wife told me that there was a possibility I'd be getting female attention, and having met Melon, you know what? It was bound to happen, but thank you very much, man.
Mercy says, to the 4 ladies watching, sorry to dash your dreams, but Mr. Burden's already beat you to the chase.
Oh, thank you, Yev.
Perspicacious Heretic says, I do believe Iran convinced the Secret Service that slope roofs are possible to stand on. Yeah, that is very tricky. It's the Secret Service, trains for a lot, but the slope of a roof, that's...
The Iranian psyops are incredible. They're just breaking the rules of geometry. So, I mean, if they have that power, what hope do we have?
I paid for college by standing on slope roofs, 12 hours a day in the Florida sun. But,
that's the interesting thing, right? Illegal immigrants can do it, but not our Secret Servicemen. They really do the jobs we don't want to do.
It's exactly right. I had to watch, living in South Florida, I had to learn the art of sloped roofs as white guy on a roof. It's like, I don't know. And, they just, it's like, more Dune references. It's like Paul and, Arrakis, we have to teach me to walk the sands, let's see here. Dan says, dear America, if you really want to do another regime change, can I pitch the UK as a better candidate? That's funny, Dan. I didn't even see your super chat, but I'm glad that eventually we came to the same conclusion. And yes, I feel at one point, if we're going to liberate anyone and bring the wonders of America, it should be to our Anglo brethren. I mean, surely, we can have a benevolent dictator somewhere in the UK and let you guys, live in your tiny villages and, eat your blood sausages. I feel like we can probably secure that.
Well, especially because I think the US-UK wars were tied at 1-1. So I think we need a tiebreaker. And that isn't a great argument for starting a war, but it's certainly better than other ones we've fallen for. So I'm willing to throw it out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can't just leave that record hanging out there. We got to dominate in everything. We're America.
Yeah. What do you think American exceptionalism was about?
Yeah. We need the rubber match. Okay, let's make this happen. Senator Brundlefly says, if U.S. particularly depends on petrodollars to paper over its fiscal profligacy, how do we extract ourselves from the Middle East without melting the economy? A very, very, very good point, but also its own kind of problem, right? Like if we have created, it's the kind of thing. Well, Rome's got to control Egypt because otherwise it doesn't get grain shipments. Well, that's true, right? But at some point, we either make the necessary reforms to bring, that back, you scale that down, or your need to control other countries endlessly destroys your empire, right? Like these are your options. So there's no easy answer to the fact that we have built our entire financial system on something that requires us to basically be active as an empire inside the Middle East. That said, if we continue on that route forever, if we never address that very difficult problem, eventually the requirements of intervention will pull us down. And that's not something we need to speculate on. That's a proven fact from history. So I hear you. That's a perfectly reasonable objection and concern, but we have to face that problem at some point. Florida Henry says, will Iran be the largest country, size and population we attacked since World War II? 90 million people in the mountains, brutal fighting. A very good point. Again, I'm trying to think if anyone would compare with Iran.
I mean, if you want to be really pedantic, we could say we technically fought the Chinese in Korea, but I mean, the point stands, right? This is a massive undertaking.
This is not you're just not walking in and knocking down, some small 2-bit country, unfortunately. But Crud State Caesar says, pretty wild that Cruz was arguing in favor of regime change, though through direct means, but his only example of U.S. regime change working was the USSR. mostly through indirect means. Yeah, I found that bizarre as well, in that he's referring to the interview, if you don't have that context in there, the regime change he talked about working was USSR, but he pointed out that ultimately the way that happened was, again, the peace through strength doctrine, the military spending, the influence campaign, more than direct military action. Also, very interestingly, and something he didn't address in that, is now we're hearing that Putin is the biggest threat in the world, right? We're literally again in a proxy war with him. So did the regime change anything ultimately? Like, don't get me wrong, I think it's great that the USSR fell. I think ultimately that whatever you have to say about Putin, probably a better life under him than it is, for the people of Russia than it was under the USSR. But how to help the United States? I mean, yeah, I'm glad we don't have this like we're going to get bombed at any moment scenario with Russia, but we are right back to fighting these people again. And so ultimately, I think the realization is, even in this success, like we're still basically having the same contest with that world power.
Well, right. We ended a proxy war, and 30 years later, we're in another proxy war. Right. If that's what's winning, if that's what winning is, okay, so we're supposed to mobilize the entire US population to fight Iran so that 30 years later we can fight Iran again.
But with a different name. They'll call the leader something different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It might be more fun to fight a sultan, or something like that.
At least I can get like an Aladdin theme going, Senator Brundlefly says, say war with Iran happens and the regime is toppled. You are in charge of the aftermath. What is least bad way to proceed? An excellent question. And again, I'm not going to put myself out there as some geopolitical expert or someone who's very familiar with the inner workings of Iran. If you do want to get a perspective from somebody who has strong ties to the country and is looking at this with a critical eye, Academic Agent recently did a stream about kind of the internal history of Iran, because he made the point, I think a very good one, that almost no one who is talking about this is actually talking about the cultural dynamics and history of Iran and what would work in that case or not. I'm not someone who knows enough to say, oh, this is how you would stabilize. What are the factions? How, I hate playing, expert when I just don't know. But if you do want a stream that might help you understand that, I think AA did a good one here last day or two. Just a blank there says, Iran with nukes is no worse than Pakistan. Again, I don't know exactly how to gauge that, but that feels like a reasonable assertion, right? Like in either case, you do have a relatively unstable government with a blood tie or with a blood feud with its neighbor, in possession of a weapon of mass destruction. A radical Islamic bent. Again, I don't know enough to one that example, but it seems reasonable. Simplar with the beaver letting us know that the Burden Gang is here. And then Marcos 588 says, to quote our buddy Furious, Egypt might raise 20 million sesterces per annum in revenue, but 30 standing legions at army costs of 30 million. So you're basically where it's going to cost us more over time to constantly be in charge of these places, even though at the time it seems like a solution to our resource problem. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up yet again. Great talking with Jay Burden. If you have not checked out his stuff, please make sure to do so. If it is your first time on this channel, please subscribe, click the bell notifications, all that stuff, so you know when we're going live. And if you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.